Every speaker today has 15 minutes to share their message with you, new ideas, calls to action, exploring critical issues. So please give our FutureFlow speakers a quick round of applause, please. All right. Without further ado, let me bring up our very first speaker onto the stage. Please join me in welcoming Josh Jacobs, who's the Sustainability Director at WAP Sustainability. Josh is a total expert in understanding the global marketplace of sustainable rating systems, codes, and building standards. And today he's going to be sharing insights on accelerating low-carbon procurement. So everybody, a quick round of applause for Josh. Josh.
So good afternoon, everyone. I see we turned your sun rays off. Sorry about that. Provocateur. It's a polite way to say that we're pains in the ass to lots of people in the world, but pains in the ass for good, much like many people in the audience, so I like that. They told us to be inspirational, not data-driven, right? Not come up here. We've got lots of other sessions to do that. So I'm going to try to be inspirational, okay? So to start with, how many folks in the room have children? Okay? How many folks in the room were children of parents? We're off to a good start. Almost all of you raised your hand, so that's a plus. That's a plus. So my big message is this, something we all learned as children. Everyone see that? I know we've had some trouble. Everyone see what that word is? Ask. We learned this at a very young age, right? I'm going to pull on the heartstrings here for a second to be that inspirational, right? The ask. Pick me up. Come on, pick me up. Or the, right? But there's the other type of ask, right? We were all kids once. How many people in the room asked their parents, or more importantly, probably their grandparents, for a popsicle or a piece of candy when they knew they weren't supposed to have it? I still ask my mom for candy and she won't give it to me. This is now a therapy session for you all, more so for me. Asking is incredibly important because if you ask enough, one time, mom and dad, grandma, grandpa, more grandma and grandpa probably, mom and dad are gonna say yes. Right? You folks have been asking for years as part of what we do at ILFI, right? As part of the sustainable building movement. We've been told no a lot. The problem is I keep hearing people say, oh, but that's not there. Oh, it's not in the marketplace. Oh, we don't have it. Ask. That's it. Just ask. Thank you. No, I'm kidding. So I'm going to show you how asking helped and where it's gotten us specifically around embodied carbon. You've heard about embodied carbon throughout the conference. Everyone knows what embodied carbon is, yes? I don't have to go through that. Awesome. I get 2 more minutes back in my life. In 2013, LEAD v4 was released. We thought for only 3 years, 11 years ago, and it had an environmental product declaration criteria in it. The year before that, we actually had a pilot credit that asked for an environmental product declaration, which helps us understand the embodied carbon of material in your LEED building. So we asked, as a marketplace, we said, hey, can you tell us what you've got inside your material? Also, material health was asked in here, right? Declare label, right? HPDs, lots of other things, chemical transparency, but I'm talking about embodied carbon, so. 2013. 2015, that went okay. Remember at that time in 2013, there were maybe a dozen actual EPDs for material here in North America. Around the world, there were some more, but we asked. 2015, the International Green Construction Code, ASHRAE 189.1, and NAHB National Green Building Standard, also known as a rating system, but also ICC 700, so it's sort of a code, all had language put in them about EPDs. They asked. Now, code technically is a tell, but not everyone was doing International Green Construction Code. In fact, at that time, no one was doing IGCC because it was brand new, right? It had been out a couple years, but it hadn't really gotten adoption. Now, they stole a lot of language from it, so we started to see EPD language in lots of areas. ASHRAE 189.1, same thing. NAHB National Green Building Standard, we actually saw some builders start to ask for embodied carbon information to meet criteria. They asked. You guys are getting a theme here. 2017, California Department of General Services. Now, they were the folks that had to implement it, but the legislature and the governor of California passed the Buy Clean California Act. What that did was said, if we're going to spend your taxpayer money on structural steel, rebar, mineral wallboard insulation, and flat glass, we're going to have it be below a certain global warming potential, which is about embodied carbon. And that helped implement a cap on what the state of California was going to spend for these 4 products in terms of embodied carbon. They asked. They kind of told. But they asked. Following that, in 2019, the County of Marin. Anyone who knows the County of Marin? Everyone else knows that it's just wine country, north of San Francisco. They passed a concrete code. You will not put concrete in our location, in our county, if it is over a certain GWP. And they speciated it per PSI. So again, they told, but they asked. 2019, this is pre-COVID, by the way, which feels like 20 years ago, but it's actually only 5. 2021, heard someone mention it earlier today, I'm very proud, MEP 2040. I am one of the steering committee members of MEP 2040. This is a group of engineering firms, started out as engineering firms, architects, design firms, those of us who are connected to this world, who started to say, we have done a kick-ass job on operational carbon, because they have, right? The manufacturers in that world, the MEP manufacturers, have done a kick-ass job on helping us lower operational carbon. What about the other side? They started to ask about the global warming potential of the HVAC material, of the chillers, of the other equipment that it takes to save that operational carbon. They put out 3 letters asking for information from the marketplace. Along that time also, we had the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act get passed. The Infrastructure Act actually put requirements in it for low carbon concrete at ports of entry in the United States. For the first time in history, the US government took their money, our money, and said, we're going to spend it on low carbon stuff. That was 2021. More people asking and incentivizing. In 2022, I can almost guarantee that a good portion of you know exactly what happened in 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act, probably the most important procurement sustainability law that has ever been passed. These organizations, the Federal Highway Administration through the Department of Transportation, the General Service Administration of the US, the largest landowner operator in the world, and the EPA got over $4.5 billion to procure and procure low carbon materials and get more low carbon information into the marketplace. Not only that, but FEMA got another $938 million. On top of that, HUD got some money on top of that. They asked. They had money, but they asked. In 2023, we had CalGreen. This is the state green building code in the state of California. It is part of their code, right? So what we had in International Green Construction Code, ASHRAE 189.1, they started to take that concept to the state of California. And of course, in the sustainability world, of course it was California that did it first. They've had Cal Green for a long time that had a lot of things in it. But the material section was incredibly light, if non-existent for a good portion of it. One of the first things they did, they implemented an embodied carbon requirement for structures over 100,000 square feet and for schools over 50,000 square feet, where you can now reuse 40% of the building, reuse it, do a whole building life cycle assessment that actually takes a lot more data from a lot more products into the whole building life cycle assessment than what we have been doing, or procure low carbon materials. California asked, they said, I want data. Give it to me now. And then in 2023, what I previously talked about, all this money started going out. General Service Administration started to name their 100 projects that they were going to use their Inflation Reduction Act money on. Where were they going to buy steel, concrete, asphalt, glass? There are 100 projects around this nation that are now using their $2.15 billion to procure low carbon material. EPA made an interim determination to determine what the GWP limits were. I'm stretching this a little bit. That was in December 2022, but you guys all didn't want to. Federal Highway started to implement how they were going to do their ask. And it's happening now in 2024, where state departments of transportation will now be able to incentivize low carbon material on their infrastructure projects. They asked. You see a couple others have come in, New York City, New York State, Colorado. These people, along with us, have asked, right? We asked. Pick us up, help us. So what did that do? I told you when we started there were probably 12 EPDs. There were lots of LCAs happening, but 12 EPDs in the marketplace. There are now 75,000 plus batch level concrete EPDs. That means on specific projects, a concrete maker in almost anywhere in the United States can tell you exactly what their embodied carbon is because they were asked for it and incentivized with cash. We will buy from you if you give me this, right? All of your projects have that ability. Ask. 6,700 EPDs, embodied carbon data for masonry, steel, aluminum, wood, insulation, cladding, gypsum board, flooring, paints. 6,700. Now the difference is they're obviously batch level concrete. There's a lot more different batch levels as opposed to I'm selling this gallon of paint, right? And that EPD is reproducible. But LEED and other things asked, architects, designers, specifiers, they asked. There's 2,600 EPDs for asphalt. Folks, this is the tip of the iceberg. MEP 2040 started to ask. We're now getting mechanical equipment EPDs in the marketplace. You know how long I've been told that's not possible? MEP 2040 asked. Then some of the large tech manufacturers that are sitting in this room and have been even presented here this week put it in their specs and said, we'll buy from you today. You can install it in 18 months when our building's done, but you will have an EPD or we're never going to buy from you again. They asked. I get very, very tired of hearing that can't be done. I've literally seen it in this marketplace. I've been doing this almost 17 years. I've been told time and time again that it's not there. If enough of us ask, it's there. Manufacturers have done an incredible job responding to the ask. Is it going to take them time? Of course it is. This isn't easy. Getting that data out of their supply chains, out of their manufacturing facilities, it's massive. amount of work. But if you ask and incentivize, it's there, and they respond. So I'm begging you, stop saying it's not there, and start asking. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Following Josh is a big ask for me now. It's so gratifying to find a sign language interpreter for the topic I'm going to talk about. My son Ishan has developmental disabilities. He uses a wheelchair and needs help with almost every function. He has significant cognitive challenges. And way back in 2006, when just for 1 year, when he was about 5 years old, he attended Timber Ridge Elementary in Marietta, a suburb just about 20 miles from here, north of here. But over the next 10 years or so, whenever we were out in the community, kids would come up to him to say hi. And when we asked how they knew Ishan, we found out that they went to the same school, that is Timber Ridge. And while his teachers were excellent and tried to make the kids with disabilities participate in inclusive programs, that still didn't cut it. Then we realized that it was due to the design of the school that was quite different from all the other schools that he has been to. At Timber Ridge, the main path of circulation connecting the 3 to 4 floors was a wide ramp. And stairs and elevators were secondary. And it meant that all kids, able-bodied or disabled, were together in that same space. It meant that kids with disabilities were not unwittingly segregated by the design of the school, as it so often happens. It meant that so-called typical kids saw my son for who he is, a person, a human, first, and then rather than a person with disabilities, someone with disabilities. And it also meant that these kids changed just a little and became enriched when they interacted with him. As someone said, no person ever steps into a river twice because first it's not the same river and nor is it the same person. That is the beauty of inclusion, of interacting with people who do not look like us or have the same abilities as us. And meaningful inclusion changes all people in an interaction. It's a two-way street. The school may or may not have won design awards, but it made a big difference in my son's life. It gave him two things that most of us crave for, but more so people with disabilities. One, visibility, and two, inclusion. In circular ways that often surprise us, some of these kids could grow or to become leaders, making policies years later that might affect my son positively, drawing on the empathy they have developed at school, interacting with fellow students who have disabilities like my son. That's my son Ishan. I'm sorry the slide is not very clear because of lighting. But that was around the time he went to Timber Ridge 16 or 17 years ago. He was 5 then, and he's 22 now. And both of us, my wife and I, like to joke that it is his considerable charm that endeared him to the students, but not really, it's the design, I think. So the main thing to note about Timber Ridge Elementary is that it went beyond the Americans with Disabilities Act, that is the ADA. The ramp was integral to the design and not an add-on. There could have been a ramp tacked on at the entry as an afterthought. There could have been an elevator in a corner, which far from the main stair, which you really had to search. And there could have been a separate accessible entrance for students with mobility issues. Special education classrooms could have been tucked away in a corner with other students in the school not even aware of their existence. And we have seen all of these situations in Ishan's other schools. He's been to 7 different schools where a typical kid would go to 3. And that, again, is a matter of equity where kids with disabilities are kind of bounced on the school system, but I'm not going to talk about that. There could have been, steep ramps, the default 1 in 12 ramps, where it could have been a little more gentler and more generous ramp. And all of these aspects which I've cataloged here might meet the ADA. They do meet the ADA, which means to design for true inclusion, like in Timber Ridge Elementary, it is imperative that we go beyond the ADA. But when we talk about going beyond the ADA, we need to first understand how the ADA came about, and then talk about going beyond, right? So the ADA is a civil rights law, and it somehow missed getting included in the major civil rights legislations in the 1960s. And the history of the struggle in the 70s and the 80s is fraught with sit-ins and demonstrations and disabled people getting the short shrift from successive administrations throughout the 70s and the 80s. And all of these are narrated in that wonderful documentary called Camp Crip, which came out during the pandemic, I think, in the summer of 2020. And if you have not seen it, I highly recommend that. It's on Netflix and YouTube. The tipping point, I think, came about in March 1990, and that's the picture from that day, when people abandoned their wheelchairs and walkers and crutches and crawled up the steps of the Capitol in very poignant scenes. And I think that pricked the conscience of the nation, and President George Herbert Walker Bush signed the ADA into law in July of the same year. I have to say that we in the disability community are standing on the shoulders of those who struggled before us, pried open doors and broke down barriers for the rest of us. Now, the ADA architectural guidelines, that is the ADA AG, the code that came out of the ADA, is probably the only code that has its origins in a struggle for equity. Not building codes, which ensure the safety of all occupants equally, but does not necessarily address equity. And not zoning codes either, whose origin story in the United States is tainted with racism, which have caused segregation and perpetuated inequity. So in that sense, the ADA AG is probably the only equity code that architects have to follow. So in July, it's going to be 34 years since the ADA was passed, and yet barriers exist. Visibility and inclusion are still elusive. And this is from an article 4 years ago on the 30th anniversary of the ADA, a headline of an article in the New York Times by disability activists, one of which was Judith Heumann, who passed away last year. And she was one of the major advocates for disability rights in the US. We are 20% of America, and we are still invisible. I think the number is actually around 25% when you consider all sorts of disabilities. And then the writers, there's Judith Heumann and John Wodach, they go on to say, people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the US, but for the most part, we remain invisible. We live in every state and in every community, and we are present in most families. But we are still subject to the same unthinking responses to emerging problems that ignore the needs, issues, or concerns of disabled people. In most cases, we remain an afterthought. Now, let me linger on that last sentence for a second. We remain an afterthought, right? And I'd say that mirrors many architects' approach to the ADA as an afterthought. Just another code and another checklist to comply with, another box to check. Not like the Timber Ridge Elementary, that's the Ishan School, or the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California, or the Harkins Institute in Des Moines, Iowa, where the design for disability is integral to the design process. and in many cases becomes generative to the design. And elements of inclusivity are baked into the concept, right from concept design. And I'm sure there are many low-profile projects like my son's school that have been designed with inclusion in mind, but they are a small number compared to the projects that follow the ADA to the letter and not use it as a point of departure for a more imaginative and more imaginative vision of what inclusive design looks like. Now, coming to the current living building challenge standard, I suggest that the core imperative under equity perpetuates this status quo by requiring projects to only meet the ADA and not surpass it. Now, the building challenge sparkles, of course, in the areas of performance codes such as energy and indoor air quality and water, where it requires projects to surpass the minimums and then some, but not in the case of ADA. And I suggest that it is a matter of equity itself that the only quote-unquote equity code is the one code for which not much is asked of architects, but to merely meet it. Now, the undisputed value of rating systems is that they raise the bar on building performance and the welfare of occupants, and the living building challenge, of course, does it much more than other rating systems, right? And of course, other projects follow, and their hand is forced by codes that have caught up, or by peer pressure and market forces. And that's exactly how meaningful and progressive change happens. It's time to raise the bar on accessible design to exceed ADA minimums. We have to enable the creation of spaces where people with disabilities not just get a foot in the door, but interact meaningfully and fully, where they are not on the margins, but on the center. And when we design for the margins, everyone benefits. So, how do we go about accessible design that goes beyond the ADA, like at my son's school? A couple of years ago, I put forward an agenda for accessible design that got an honorable mention in a competition on what is accessible architecture. And I'll show you a few excerpts. So, when we are in the next design meeting or the next project, when we are working on the next drawing, let's think of some of these aspects of an accessible architecture that considers regulatory compliance as minus ground zero and principles of universal design as a minimum. Number two, an architecture which is an inclusive architecture that embraces and celebrates otherness of disability, gender, race, sexuality, class, immigration, caste, etc. And recognizes that otherness is natural, a part of the human experience, and not a problem that needs to be fixed. An architecture that emerges from a collaborative approach with people with disabilities having a seat at the table in space programming and conceptual stages of design, where people with lived experiences have that seat at the table. An architecture that is sincerely diverse and rich and addresses the widest spectrum of disability or ability, both visible and invisible, and creates environments where neurodivergent people flourish. And finally, number five, an architecture that reclaims and reaffirms dignity and self-worth of people with disabilities. And it provides safe, restorative spaces that make them whole from the indignities of everyday negotiations and transactions that people with disabilities need to make to simply live. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Great to see an audience with so few gray hairs. You know, last few conferences I've had, there have been several, but I guess it makes sense, living future. You're all the leaders and future leaders that are worried about the living future, right? My generation, a lot of us are trying to figure out how we got here, whether globally or nationally or individually. Few of us have ended or are currently where we thought we'd be when we stepped into our professional careers. I personally grew up on a generational farm in Colorado. My ancestors settled Boulder County, Colorado in the 1800s. I knew 5 of my 8 great-grandparents. They all lived into their 90s back then. But I dreamed of being an architect and couldn't wait to get away from the farm where all the generations, grandparents, aunts and uncles, everyone still was. And so I went to the University of Colorado to become an architect. And my first summer at college, I took a job in the mountain resorts in Colorado instead of going back to the farm. And I was soon seduced into the hospitality industry. Now, that's a whole nother story I could tell you at the after-hours party, maybe. But when I went back to school, I took a job with Stouffer's Food Corporation, who had just opened a restaurant in Denver. And I ended up in the management and into their hotel opening team. And they moved me to Atlanta, Georgia. After opening that hotel way back in 1972, I knew that a few months later I was going to be transferred out of Atlanta. And I'd fallen in love with Atlanta. I mean, this was literally hot Atlanta. Shortly after I arrived here, we reached 1 million people. So you can see we're approaching 6 million. So Atlanta has really had a growth factor. And there was an opportunity to be part of that. And so for the next 22 years, I grew that company to 36 restaurants in 8 states. We'd have some 5 W-2s in a year. It was all the measures of success. I was on all the right boards for arts and health, 3 darling daughters, going to all the right parties. We had taken our company public, and it was all the measures of success. But I wasn't having any fun anymore. The boards I was on, I didn't think we were making any difference with the diseases. The arts organizations will always go broke if we didn't raise X amount of money in the next few years. And the politicians I was supporting, they weren't getting elected. And so I decided to step off that corporate treadmill. And I found myself running back to our weekend farm, or running to our weekend farm. It was running to what I had run away from 30 years earlier when I graduated from high school. So it's very interesting, the path we take. But then in 7 years of retirement, life was great. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't bored. We became concerned about urban sprawl. Our farm was 40 minutes southwest of here. It was the area that no one was going to. This was no bad schools, no infrastructure, no one thought about it. So that's why we were able to buy a lot of land. My first reaction was to start buying more land. And at 900 acres, I realized that I couldn't buy my protection from urban sprawl. And so we started looking at what we could do. Maybe we could have a model. I realized that a lot of models end up attracting what they're trying to change. And so we spent the next 2 years bringing 500 landowners together to look at the last 40,000 acres in South Fulton County. You're in Fulton County right now. It runs a long county. Now, I was very fortunate that Ray Anderson, who many of you know, had been a friend way before he became the environmental person you know. We knew him from the early days. In fact, his stepson's godfather to our now 36-year-old. So we had a long journey of acquaintance. And one night I said to Ray, you know all the smart people, help me. And so he asked the Rocky Mountain Institute to bring a group of thought leaders. And so in September of 2000, they brought 23 thought leaders. Bill Browning, who many of you know, was with Rocky Mountain Institute and facilitated that. Now, I wanted to have something like where I grew up, where we grew our own food, where we knew our neighbors, where we had generational living. And Bill talked about biophilic design on the community scale. And I said, gee, that's a fancy, intelligent-sounding word for what I'm looking for. You know, that's kind of common sense. That's just the way you should live, right? But now there's a fancy name for it. And so we started looking at how we could create a biophilic community. And what I discovered is that we were dealing with a lot of silos that were disconnected through these last decades as we put rules and regulations out of fear. And most of these silos weren't talking to each other. And there were lots of unintended consequences happening between these silos. And so we looked at what we could do. And out of the recession, when people stopped thinking that I was crazy and looking for my marijuana patch out in the woods, some of the bankers started coming to see what we were doing, because out of the recession, they realized that environmental and walkable communities were some of the first to come out of the recession. We started walking out in 2010. And so we started identifying this and realized what we were looking for is personal well-being, community engagement, and global balance, which we're all talking about. And then Puck Muckleby was one of our scholars in residence when he had retired from the Pentagon and was writing his book on the grand strategy. And he said, Steve, what you're doing here is also part of our national security if we strengthen our communities. And so while there's a lot to talk about today, I only have time to talk about three, and that's land use, community engagement, and our food systems. First, in the land. We looked at this 40,000 acres and looked at what was going to happen if we continued as Metro Atlanta had done through the last years. And we were going to disturb 80% of the land for 30,000 houses. And we didn't like that. We were able to bring both the pro-development and the preservationists together with a task of how could we give each more. Our zoning now in 40,000 acres, largest land use in 2002 that's been changed to Metro Atlanta for years. We will disturb only 30% of the land, leaving 70% in agricultural zoning. Because we're clustering it, we will put 20% more housing than Metro Atlanta and most urban cities do in the last 3 decades. Now, the old way is car dependent, and we are totally a walkable community. So there's lots of economic stories that make this make a lot of sense. You know, the benefits are trees hold carbon, and our carbon, just at Serenbe, the trees we're saving is like 180 some thousand car emissions a year. There was a story done that we were the lungs of Atlanta because the wind here blows northeast, and so we're supplying Atlanta with a lot of fresh air. How many have read Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv? Our kids' brains are developing differently because we're not in natural settings. So much there. 300 kids at Serenbe. The big health issue is there's not one reported sign of asthma, statistically impossible in the United States, not to mention their sense of empowerment. I had a group down looking at Serenbe yesterday from a city. They were amazed. There were 2 8-year-old girls that came in and ordered their cookies and thing after school. They said, you know, did you walk here by yourself? Yes. Where do you live? Oh, down the street. You know, it's unusual. We're working on free-range kids. We have free-range kids and uncaged elders. That shouldn't be unusual, but it is. But this isn't just in planned development. There are studies that show, this is from a housing development, and showed the difference that connection to nature makes in people connecting with each other, and it lowers aggression. Yet we've been building places that disconnect us from nature and each other for all these decades. We have to change this. This shows you how dense parts of Serenbe are. This is our model community that we're building. Everything, all the trees that you see there are going to remain trees 100 years from now, except the white area. And we're getting ready to take those trees down this summer for an aging in place campus. That's 7 acres of aging in place that's coming in. So I mentioned, connecting to each other and to nature are the key thing for mental health and physical health. And a lot of studies coming out of the pandemic that are showing that. These are gathering places. These pictures were taken in the middle of the pandemic. These are places we already had, gathering places on the street. We didn't miss a beat during the pandemic. In fact, we were more social. You can see this is a cocktail party. They just were in separate benches, but these were places we still had and still have today. Porches pulled close to the street. Everybody walked down the street talking to their neighbors on the porches, the spontaneous areas. And play throughout the community and intergenerational play is a huge thing that we have, and people notice that at the community. We put mail stations rather than mailboxes at your front yard or at the end of the street. We have more people that create relationships going to get mail. The joke is it takes me 2 hours to get mail at Serenbe because of who you run into. We have hospitality, coffee shops, restaurants scattered throughout, play stations, arts, and so intergenerational opportunities are happening on a regular basis. Our food system, another critical thing. We have the farm. New York Reporter did a story and called it an agrihood, and this is kind of the beginning of the agrihood movement. Organic farms are not stinky or smelly as people think industrial are. So that's our farm. Most people know our farmers. So much to do with our regenerative soils. How many people have seen Common Ground, the movie? Not enough. Go, I think it's streaming now. I'm not sure if it's mainstreaming. It's hitting. It received the best environmental documentary this last year. We have just got to change our food systems. The first time in civilization that we have malnutrition and obesity in the same body. So we're not only destroying our own bodies, but we're destroying the dirt that's growing our food. And if we deal with our agricultural and grazing lands, we would take most care of most of our carbon. And we're just not dealing with it. Go see Common Ground. When you live with food, you have a greater awareness of fresh food. We have blueberry bushes at all of our crosswalks. Our kids know the seasonality of food, and they're not expecting to have various things year-round. It makes a huge difference to know who's growing your food, and the volunteers, they get to go out there and do that. So one of the easy ways that I think of to explain what a biophilic community is, it's simply respect for one another and for nature. And if we would just think about the decisions we make, and is that how we would like to be treated, or is that the way in the places we'd like to live, I think we'd have a very different world. So I encourage you to come see us. We're just 40 minutes. We weren't able to organize buses, but if anyone wants to come out and see Serenbe, we'll be happy to host a tour 10 o'clock Friday. Just email me so we know you're coming, and I'll let you know where we can meet and come see what we're doing. Totally open community, about 1,200 people living there. I mentioned all the kids. We have our own school with geothermal. We're geothermal mandatory. So a lot of environmental things that there wasn't time to cover today. So I'm glad to see so many young people here. You are going to be the future that's going to fix a lot of things that my generation allowed to happen. So thanks, y'all.
I stepped on the stage and I touched it to my head. I grew up as a dancer. And as a dancer, when you step on any stage, You actually touch it and pay homage to the gods. And today I feel so privileged to share this platform with the speakers ahead of me that I touched it again. I'm not a very humble person. I have a pretty good sense of self-worth. But this is a very humbling moment. As someone who is not a sustainability professional, to come and speak in front of all of you is a privilege. So I thank you for giving me the stage today. I'll also share with you that this entire presentation, the abstract for it, I wrote in 5 minutes. And I submitted it in pure frustration. I came out of a board meeting. I am still in the corporate wheel right now. I'm still on that mill. And I came out of a conversation where we were talking for 2 or 3 hours on something that felt so simple, and we couldn't make a decision about it. I was like, what the hell is happening? I did my architecture in India. I did my master's in Singapore. I did my PhD in Texas. I lived in New Zealand. So I've had a very global exposure, and then I took this path of research and practice. So I've grown up in some ways loving data, loving investigation and exploration, and learning how it's not enough. Why? We have enough research, we have enough data. Thank you to the person who said, stop doing redundant research. We've got enough on the key things that matter. Let's do the things that really, really matter. And yet, we cannot seem to move the needle. What is happening? So this is what I started investigating. And that's why the talk is called Why Climate Action is a Human Perception Problem. I'm a student of human behavior. My entire work is around how experiences are shaped and how humans create relationships with their environments. Right? And I put my entire abstract there because I wanted you to know that this was 5 minutes. And I'll read it out. It starts with saying, let's start here. I am not a sustainability professional. I am, however, a student of human perception, and I believe our challenges are foundational because of the way we think, feel, and act. I'm often exhausted by how hard it can be to corral around the critical issues of our times. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. And I argue that there are 3 things at play. 1, to truly understand climate change, and we'll talk about this in a way psychologists have talked about it, and why it's so impossible for us to build empathy for the planet until we get enough wisdom, and by that time, often it is too late. Ability to build trust with people who may have divergent viewpoints, and more importantly, divergent languages. I mean, I often talk about how equity is such a huge challenge because it has the most inclusive mission and the most exclusive language. Yeah, cannot be that hard. And disciplinary arrogance, and this is something I feel very strongly about, disciplinary arrogance that results in exclusive language. Until you get to the point where you're saying, you and I are using different words, I think we're saying the same thing. Can we get beyond the words? Can we get beyond the words? So this was what it came from, right? It was this angst on what is going on. Why can't we move the needle? We are spending more and more time on things that feel really simple. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to see more examples of what we just saw before us? I don't know how clear these images are. This is generated by DALL-E, an AI-generated future. Those are images of slums in India, war-ravaged worlds. And what's fascinating to me is at the same time, today, we are world building, which is the term you use in AI. We are getting really good at world building, and we're doing a shitty job of world preserving. And it's okay. Apparently so. So again, it's this contradiction of our times that is so interesting to me. Can you see this image? The top of the tree is a brain. This is from Neuroscience News. And there is more and more research, very compelling research. You saw some of it in the previous presentation, about direct impacts, not just on physical health, but on mental health and brain health. Direct impacts, right? This one is an interesting study that says the two most prevalent mental disorders in the world, depression and anxiety, is 71% lower in urban dwellers who live near green spaces. Mental disorders, 71% lower in those who live near green spaces. Ding. Right? And then if I say the statistic, you'll be like, yeah, I kind of know that. I read that. But the gap between knowing that and reading that and making that happen is still a huge one. There's an argument, and this entire article, by the way, is called Warming World, Changing Minds, Climate's Effect on the Brain. But they talk about it in terms of two pathways. And again, I love the daylight. I hate what it does to the visibility of our slides. So let me just put it out there. But path A is what happens because of the environment to your brain. Extreme weather conditions, poor air quality, stress and anxiety. And what you can do is protection from extreme weather, exposure to nature, biophilia, beautifully described in the previous presentation, now more and more virtual strategies, right? That's path A. Path B is the even bigger problem, which is brain to environment. Our challenges with pro-environmental behavior, consumer decisions, investment decisions. It's how the brain processes issues about the environment. If I ask you this question, like raise your hand if you're nowhere. Anyone who's nowhere? Everyone is somewhere, right? We're all somewhere. The other immense reality is that somewhere is where our body sits and our brain sits within, and that's the central processing unit. That's the one that's absorbing all the information and going back and doing something different. And it's able to do that because the way our brain is wired is slightly different. So the need for climate change communication, behavior change, psychological barriers, and removing that is important. Some of you may be aware of this. I wasn't. There are a lot of psychology labs now fully focused on climate action. 100% focused on climate action. There's a lot of research, and you do not have to read this. I will send this to you that makes the link between climate anxiety, climate-related PTSD, very specific fear and anxiety that comes from it, and very specific areas of the brain that are affected. The science is now nuanced. But I love this quote the most. How your brain stops you from taking climate change seriously. Part of the reason it takes us so long to act is because the human brain has spent nearly 200,000 years focused on the present. We are hardwired to think, find food, make shelter, mate. If I can find food, I'm not thinking about the food supply. If the food you give to me in the Walmart aisles is good enough, that's what I'm going, because I got my food, I got my shelter. You want me to be worried about the climate? I don't even know what the climate is in this room. So what is my relationship to the climate? So again, it only began to contemplate time and by extension, the future within the last few hundred years. So I want you to kind of process that. The human brain for 200,000 years was just surviving. Food, shelter, procreate. For the last few hundred years, we have learned to write, we've learned to think. But what's driving our decisions is this ancient limbic fight or flight brain. And that is your CEO and your CFO and the most smart people in the room who are still responding to limbic brain directives. It's important to know that because no one wants to believe that their daily activities, from switching on a light to checking the phone, has actually resulted in millions of people turning into climate refugees. And I love this last sentence, and I'll read it out. So people change their mind about the issues rather than changing their habits because it's an easier way to cope. I am so excited that psychologists are taking this on because that's how you unlock a new way of thinking. There's a lab out of Victoria. They have what they call the dragons of inaction. 7 dragons of inaction, starting with limited cognition and accepting, however smart we are, we have limited cognition as a species. We are theory smart. But what's driving our decisions and behaviors is still our ancient brain. This term that they use, environmental numbness. We are numb to the environment. We talk about it, but there's a numbness in us because it doesn't affect us directly. Ideologies, comparison with others, sunk cost, discredence, this idea of mistrust, denial, reactance. What are the perceived risks? And limited behavior, and again, tokenism, the token behavior, enough for me to fit in, but not enough for me to actually change. And if you look it up, if you just research, do a Google search on dragons of inaction, it'll come up. And this group is working on the psychological barriers to climate change mitigation, getting to really accept, here's how you think, this is how the human brain is wired. How do I get to that core building block of decision making to make change happen? You can't see this image, so you're going to miss my DALI experimentation. This is the burning world. And this is the brain nested in a body, nested in a biosphere. And in the middle is our apathetic generation that is looking at the phones. Right? You're like, I'm missing something. But you know what the phone does? And I have been victim to it today too, is you have the instant gratification, and the instant gratification of immediate feedback is what appeals to the ancient brain. I do something, you do something back. All right, you want me to think about something that happens 100 years in the future? I'm really struggling. So, to end this, 3 suggestions for us to talk about. The first one I think is the most simplest. Make place personal again. The idea of place attachment, loving where you are. Again, I love the story about Serenbe, and it's starting from a ranch with multiple generations. I have no intimate relationship with where I live. I have a very intimate relationship with my Zoom and a global network of people and friends who are all over the world, and Instacart sometimes. I'm not asking the question on where is my food coming from. I don't have an intimate relationship with those who are in the farmer's market who I'm meeting. It's just really interesting that our personal relationship with place is gone. We are so global that it's not personal. But if it was, if you thought about my park, my food, my water, automatically that appeals to your hindbrain, your limbic brain, and suddenly you make different decisions because it's personal. Now, where this really struck me was visiting Hawaii. How many people have been to Hawaii? Does sustainability not feel steeped in? You never hear the word, but it's in the culture. If you ask them about the volcano and when can I get to go see one like a typical tourist, they will respond and say, it depends on her mood. Nature is personal. They have a way of talking about nature as someone who actually has the real power. Like, really? Depends on her mood. You may be lucky, you may not be lucky. She's not going to work on your clock. The way they talk about mountains, the way they talk about rivers, what you see in that culture, it's personal to them. Whereas when we are in such a global distributed world, place isn't personal anymore. And if place isn't personal, how will the planet be personal? Because the relationship of a person to the planet is place. Place is my love relationship with the geolocation of where I am, right? So that's one. The second is, let's please get the climate scientists and the human scientists and the designers together. Let's unlock those who know how the mind works and those who know how the environment works, and let's get them together with the most compelling designers of graphics, communication, space, place, any scale of design you want to think of. But I think it's really important, the silos in which we have trapped ourselves and the disciplinary arrogance that it's breeding, and this us versus them narrative of, you don't get me. I have a big issue and I understand it, but you don't understand me. We have created this exclusive space for something that we are trying to achieve together. So I think we really need to bring people together, and perhaps we need to avoid using words for a little bit because words are getting in the way. And finally, and I want to do a shout out to Adele. I don't know if she's in the room. Are you in the room? Yay! We had a chance to work with Adele a few summers ago about changing the conversation and speaking this co-benefit language, where you talk about the things that matter in the language of the stakeholder. Whether it's the developer or the local government or the operator or the end user, speak in their language. Be a linguist. Let go of the language you believe in, the words you love, and speak in their language and say, this is good for all of us because it's simple. And for all of that to happen, the one thing we don't talk enough about is we need some joy back in our lives. We need some play. We need to make this fun. It cannot feel so difficult, because I can't process difficult. If you give me something very difficult, I am pushing the can down the road as long as my food, my shelter, and my procreation today is covered. It's just, that's how we are wired. But if we did make it fun, if we got this play back into our lives, this relationship between people and planet through play, through this relationship to place, maybe it wouldn't feel so goddamn hard. Thank you for your time.
Wow. I don't know about you, but to me it felt like we were peeling the onion today, and how we change the world. We started with that outer skin, right? Carbon procurement, right? The things that we need to ask of the people who govern us, of our communities, of decision makers, the demands that we need to make, right? Josh said, ask. But how do we know what to ask, right? And that comes all the way down to Upali saying, look within yourself, right? Look within yourself and understand, what are the relationships that are broken? Where are our barriers? What are the things that stand in our way? And along the way, we find that we need to build new understanding of what community means. We need to understand, this idea of a minority or a majority is ultimately meaningless. If we don't design for everyone, we design for no one. And I think that's what Ganesh reminded us of today, right? And also that community is not just human community, right? We have a relationship with nature. And that's why this idea of biophilia has been so powerful right at the heart of the regenerative design movement, because ultimately what it signals is a transformed relationship with nature. And that transformation, again, to come back to Upali's point, comes from within, right? And I think that's what we're here to do. We're here to mend that relationship, to enter into a new kind of contract with the world as individuals and as communities. And I'm walking away from today's sessions so inspired, and I hope you are too. I'm going to welcome you again to another session of FutureFlow Talks tomorrow at 1:45 right here. So come back here and we'll hear even more amazing perspectives, insights, and provocations. But for now, we have a reception for you in the grand ballroom. So I hope you know how to get there. It's right by where everybody had lunch today. And we are going to have an after party. So I hope you'll join us for that too, right? There's no movement without sharing happiness, breaking bread, and being in each other's company. So let's do that. Thank you all so much for a beautiful, beautiful day.